We all remember that sweet girl with pigtails singing about rainbows in The Wizard of Oz. But what if I told you that Hollywood's brightest fairy tale concealed a documented crime? While the world reveled in the screen's charm, 16-year-old Judy Garland withered in gilded cages, force-fed amphetamines, working 72 hours without sleep. She starved, forced to smoke 80 cigarettes a day. Her own mother pushed her into an abortion for the sake of a contract, and those cute munchkin actors were 40-year-old perverts who harassed the teen on set without consequence. Today, we'll rip the mask off the dream factory and uncover how men in expensive suits physically destroyed the world's most famous child. This isn't a story about talent. It's a story of how men in expensive suits shattered a child to rake in billions. And it didn't start with a tragic end. It began with vitamins given to keep her awake for 3 days straight. Act 1. The 72-hour protocol. Chemical collar. To grasp the tragedy of Judy Garland, you first need to ditch the most popular myth about star addicts. We like to think celebrity addictions stem from wild living, poolside parties, and a life of excess. We read the headlines and think, she couldn't handle fame. But with Judy, that's a lie. She didn't take drugs for pleasure. She took them to survive a schedule that defied human limits. Her addiction wasn't a moral failing, it was a corporate standard. Imagine your boss making you down a glass of vodka every morning to keep you cheery, then clubbing you over the head at night so you'd pass out fast and not waste time tossing in bed. That's what MGM did to a teenager's body. In the 30s, MGM ran like Henry Ford's factory, but instead of cars, they had people on the line. And this factory had a problem: labor laws and biology. Teens need sleep, food, and rest. To Louis Mayer, the studio head, these needs were production defects. The solution came from the studio's infirmary. MGM's doctors cooked up a special diet for Judy and her partner, Mickey Rooney. Mornings meant amphetamines. Back then, it was benzodrine. These potent stimulants pushed the nervous system to its limits, making eyes shine with that signature sparkle, forcing the brain to ignore fatigue. But amphetamines had a downside. After 18 hours of filming, the wired kid couldn't physically sleep, and the next day's shoot started in 4 hours. The studio couldn't wait for Judy to calm down naturally, so they gave her a second handful of pills, heavy barbiturates, sleeping pills. These didn't offer restful sleep, they just shut off consciousness, plunging her into a chemical coma. They called it bolts and jolts. Picture the scene, the set. Judy's been on her feet for 2 days. She's swaying from exhaustion. Lines are slipping. She's about to faint. The director doesn't yell, "Cut, everyone sleep." He nods at the doctor. The doctor approaches the girl and hands her another dose of vitamins. 20 minutes later, her heart's racing like a hunted rabbit, pupils dilated, she's ready to dance again. This carousel could spin for 72 hours straight. 3 days without sleep, just chemicals. The studio literally hacked her metabolism. They learned to switch a person on and off with a snap, like a desk lamp. The problem is, when you do this to a developing child's body for years, the switch breaks. By 20, Judy couldn't sleep without pills and couldn't wake without them. She lived in a perpetual fog where only the director's commands were real. But the scariest part wasn't what the doctors did to her. The real horror began when the amphetamines peaked, and around her, on the set of the world's kindest fairy tale, gathered a crowd of strange men. Act 2. The Real Monsters of Oz. If chemical dependency was an invisible cage, then what happened on set was open, physical, and psychological terror. The behind-the-scenes of The Wizard of Oz would today trigger a federal investigation and mass arrests. The Wizard of Oz is a cultural monolith, a symbol of childhood and belief in miracles. We see Dorothy, scared of the Wicked Witch of the West or the roaring lions, and admire her sincerity. But the chilling truth is that the fear in Judy Garland's eyes was all too real. She wasn't afraid of the fairy tale characters in makeup, but of her charming colleagues on set. This shatters the brightest Hollywood fairy tale. We're used to being charmed by the Munchkins, those little people welcoming Dorothy. But reality turns these scenes into a grotesque psychological thriller where a child was trapped among predators. Let's start with the facts MGM tried to erase from collective memory for decades. To create the magical lands crowd, the studio hired over 100 dwarf actors. To the audience, they seemed like amusing fairy tale creatures. But in reality, it was a crowd of adult men, many over 40, with hard life stories and often aggressive behavior. The studio housed them all in the Culver Hotel, and by numerous accounts, including producer Mervyn LeRoy, it became a chaos epicenter. Drunken brawls, fights, shattered glass. The police were called so often that the hotel had to hire bouncers for every floor. But if they just wrecked property at the hotel, their target on set was the main star. Judy Garland later bitterly called them little drunks. But behind this seemingly harmless nickname was a story of systematic harassment. Imagine the situation. A 16-year-old girl, pumped full of amphetamines, disoriented and exhausted, surrounded by a crowd of adult men. Judy's third husband, Sid Luft, revealed shocking details in his memoirs, which she shared with him years later. According to him, these people turned her life into hell. Using their height as cover, they surrounded her before takes and did things that would get them beaten anywhere else. They shoved hands under her dress, pinched her, and made lewd comments. It was a surreal nightmare. Judy couldn't run because, camera, action. She couldn't complain because the schedule was tight, and the director needed a picture of joy. She was forced to smile and sing with people who, just minutes before action, physically harassed her. This created a monstrous cognitive dissonance. The safest place in the script, the land of the Munchkins, was the most dangerous in reality. But the threat wasn't just from people. The very environment Judy worked in was toxic in the literal sense. The Technicolor technology, which gave the film its legendary bright colors, required a colossal amount of light. The lighting equipment of that time emitted monstrous heat. Temperatures on set often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In this oven, Judy had to not just stand, but dance and skip down the yellow brick road. Meanwhile, she wore a brutal corset. Studio bosses that at 16, she was already too womanly for the role of a little girl from Kansas. They wanted a flat board, not a developing girl's body. So, costume designers tightened the corset every morning with such force that it literally compressed her internal organs and deformed her spine. Try to imagine this physical experience. You're on stimulants, your heart racing wildly, the temperature around you is 100 degrees, and you physically can't take a deep breath because your chest is encased in steel and fabric. And in this state, you're required to deliver crystal clear vocals. Chronic back pain, which would haunt Garland for the rest of her life, was a direct gift from the Wizards costume department. But the final chord of this madness was the famous poppy field scene. Remember that moment? Dorothy falls asleep under the witch's spell, and Glinda the Good Witch sends saving snow to wake the heroes. It's one of the most beautiful visual images in cinema history. In reality, it was a scene of mass poisoning. In '39, there was no safe computer graphics or artificial snow made of paper. To create the effect of a light, fluffy snowfall, the studio used industrial chrysotile asbestos. Yes, you heard right. On Judy Garland, lying on the floor and gasping for air, as much as the suffocating corset allowed, they dumped pure carcinogen by the ton. The entire crew breathed in the deadly dust, but Judy was at the epicenter. The fact that her lungs survived this assault is a true medical miracle, especially considering the fate of the first Tin Man, Buddy Ebsen, who was rushed to intensive care and replaced by another actor because his lungs failed from the aluminum powder in the makeup. The Wizard of Oz wasn't a fairy tale. It was an obstacle course for survival, where the main prize was just making it to the end of the shift. Act 3. Contract on the unborn. If you think chemical castration through pills and physical torment on set were the limits of inhumanity, you underestimate Louis Mayer's cynicism. What we've discussed so far touches on exploiting her work hours and health. But now we dive into the most fundamental right of any living being, the right to reproduce and start a family. This is where Judy Garland's story stops being a mere biography of an actress and turns into a chronicle of slavery, in the literal, legal sense. A slave is someone who doesn't own their body or its fruits. To MGM, Judy wasn't an employee but expensive breeding stock, forbidden from having offspring if it threatened the studio's stock prices. By 19, despite the endless drug haze and psychological pressure, Judy attempted her first real rebellion. She fell in love. Her chosen one was musician David Rose. For Garland, this wasn't just a marriage. It was an escape. A hope that being a wife and mother would finally let her grow up and shed the eternal girl image forced on her by producers. Shortly after the wedding in 41, Judy found out she was pregnant. For any normal family, this news is a miracle. Judy was ecstatic. For the first time in her life, she had something of her own. Something real, not dictated by screenwriters and directors. She wanted this child more than anything. But when MGM's management got wind of it, their reaction was immediate and cold. No congratulations echoed in the studio offices, only calculators. The boss's logic was ironclad and monstrous. Judy Garland is Dorothy, the eternal child with braids. In Mayer's view, the American public wouldn't pay a cent to see a pregnant Dorothy. Pregnancy destroyed the brand. Pregnancy meant a 9-month filming hiatus plus recovery time. To the corporation, Judy's child wasn't a new life, but a loss on the balance sheet, a defective asset. And the marriage was to be written off. The most horrifying aspect of this tragedy is who became the executioner. It wasn't a faceless doctor. It was her own mother, Ethel Gum. Judy's mother conspired with the studio. Together with Louis Mayer, they arranged a forced termination of the pregnancy. Imagine the level of psychological violence. Judy is called on the carpet. She's told she's nothing without the studio, that she'll ruin her career and let down hundreds of people if she decides to give birth. They tell her she's still a child herself, whom they pump full of drugs, incapable of motherhood. This wasn't a medical indication. It was a punitive operation. They took her to a studio-organized hospital where everything was done quickly and quietly. The official story for the press and public? Another exhaustion or minor procedure. Judy Garland wasn't just deprived of her child. She was stripped of her voice regarding her own womb. She was shown clearly, your body belongs to MGM shareholders. We decide when you sleep, when you eat, and when you give birth. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Years later, when she became pregnant by her next husband, Vincente Minnelli, the story repeated, although that time she managed to fight for the right to have Liza. But the trauma from the first forced abortion stayed with her forever. It broke something fundamental within her. She realized that to the people she called family, her mother in the studio, she was just a function. After this event, her breakdowns became uncontrollable. If before she took pills because she was forced to, now she started taking them to numb the unbearable emotional pain and guilt over the unborn child. She sought oblivion because the reality, where she was forced to kill her own dream for box office returns, was too terrifying to face with sober eyes. Act 4. Architect of pain. We've reached the root of the evil. If the doctors were the enforcers and her mother the accomplice, the mastermind behind this crime was one man, Louis Mayer, head of MGM, the most powerful man in Hollywood, feared even by gangsters. Biographies often paint him as a stern but wise father of the studio, the one who introduced Judy's talent to the world. But reality sketches a classic sociopath and abuser, wielding power not just to make films, but to satisfy his sadistic urges. To understand Mayer and Garland's relationship is to grasp how Hollywood broke people. It wasn't a boss and employee story, it was master and pet. Mayer crafted a relationship with Judy that modern psychologists would call deep, traumatic grooming. He made her believe she was worthless, owing him every breath. Mayer had a unique strategy for managing Garland. He shattered her ego, only to rebuild it to suit the studio's needs. Judy was a teenager with typical insecurities. Mayer didn't just know them, he targeted them with surgical precision. He gave her a nickname that haunted her life, "My Little Hunchback." Judy had a spinal curvature and a short neck, causing her to slouch. Instead of helping her with posture or choosing the right costumes, the head of the world's largest corporation humiliated her at every meeting, pointing out her physical flaw. The logic was monstrous. Mayer convinced her she was ugly, that she lacked Lana Turner's beauty or Ava Gardner's grace. "You're an ugly duckling," he'd tell her. "But I, Louis Mayer, am so great and kind, I'll make a star out of such a freak." He instilled in the child a sense of eternal, unpayable debt. She worked herself to the bone, not for money, but to earn the love of her tormentor, who graciously allowed her to be on screen. But the psychological pressure wasn't the end of it. Memories of meetings in Mayer's office are a chronicle of blatant harassment, impossible to defend against. Garland later recounted how these work meetings went. Mayer loved to play the role of a kind daddy. He'd sit the 16-year-old girl on his lap. This was already crossing all boundaries, but what followed went beyond criminal. He'd start talking about music, about how important it was to sing from the heart. And under this pretext, he'd place his hand on her left breast. "I'm just checking how your heart beats when you sing," he'd say. Imagine the horror. The most influential man in the industry, whose word could decide your family's fate, holding his hand on your body under the guise of caring for art. Judy froze in fear. She knew, if she flinched, screamed, or pushed him away, the fairy tale would end. She'd be thrown out, her career destroyed, her livelihood gone. Mayer was a master of emotional manipulation. If threats and humiliation didn't work, or if Judy, driven to despair, tried to rebel, he'd change tactics. He'd start crying. Real tears. Mayer was the best actor at MGM, though he never stood in front of a camera. He'd shout, "Judy, you're breaking my heart. After all I've done for you, I love you like my own daughter, and you want to betray me just because you want to sleep?" This was the ultimate form of gaslighting. He flipped the situation so that he became the victim, the all-powerful multi-millionaire, and the aggressor was the exhausted teenage girl. And it worked flawlessly. Judy, with her sensitive and vulnerable soul, began to feel guilty. She'd rush to comfort her executioner, apologize for her weakness, and obediently return to the set to swallow another dose of amphetamines, just so Daddy Mayer wouldn't cry. This man controlled every aspect of her existence. His spies reported who she met, what she said, and what she wrote in her diaries. He decided what clothes she wore outside of work. He even controlled her earnings. While films with Garland brought the studio hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms, Judy herself received only crumbs, strictly regulated by contract. Mayer kept her financially dependent, so she had no resources to escape. He didn't just break Judy Garland, he engineered her trauma. He deliberately created an inferiority complex so deep that no global fame could fill it. He made her believe that love was pain, control, and humiliation. That's why, for the rest of her life, Even after leaving MGM, Judy subconsciously sought men who repeated Mayer's pattern, exploiting her talent, degrading her dignity, and controlling her life. He was the architect of her pain, and the structure he built was so strong that Judy never escaped it, even long after her jailer was dead. Act 5. The First Pusher. In every tale of child exploitation, one question always looms. Where were the parents? Why didn't they step in? Why didn't they pull their daughter out of this hell? In Judy Garland's case, the answer is more chilling than silence. Her parents weren't just passive onlookers. Her mother, Ethel Gum, actively participated in her daughter's destruction. We love to demonize studio bosses like Mayer. It's easy. They're rich, cynical capitalists. But the truth is, Mayer didn't have to break Judy's moral barriers from scratch. Her mother had already done that job for him. Ethel Gum wasn't Judy's protector. She was her first pusher in the arts and her first dealer. Judy Garland, born Frances Gum, came from a family of vaudeville performers. Ethel Gum was the classic stage mom from hell, a woman with unfulfilled ambitions who decided to live her failed star life through her child's body. The myth says MGM's evil doctors hooked an innocent girl on pills. Reality is harsher. Judy knew the taste of stimulants long before she ever set foot in the studio. Ethel started giving her pills when she was just 10. The family toured the country with the vaudeville act, the Gum Sisters. The schedule was grueling, the travel was overnight, and the conditions were tough. When little Frances got tired and wanted to sleep, her mom didn't tuck her in. She gave her pep vitamins. Ethel understood a simple formula. An energetic child pleases the crowd. A tired one does not. Applause turned into money, and her daughter's health didn't factor into the equation. When Judy signed with MGM, Ethel didn't step aside. On the contrary, she became the studio's watchdog within the family. The studio paid Judy's salary directly to Ethel. This created a monstrous dynamic. The mother's welfare depended directly on how much she could squeeze out of her daughter. Ethel worked closely with Mayer. If Judy acted up on set, refused pills, or said she was too tired, directors didn't waste time persuading her. They called Ethel. Her mother would storm the studio and cause a scene. She'd scream, "You ungrateful brat! You want us to go back to poverty? Take the pills and get to work." For Judy, it was a double betrayal. The home that should have been a fortress was an extension of the studio. She had nowhere to run. Judy Garland later said a phrase that hits right in the heart. "My mother was the real Wicked Witch of the West." In the movie, Dorothy kills the witch with a bucket of water. In life, Judy couldn't shake her mother for years. Ethel used emotional blackmail, threatening suicide or a heart attack every time Judy tried to set boundaries. Moreover, Ethel actively supported the starvation policy. When Judy begged for food, her mother personally checked her plate, leaving only broth. She'd say, "You don't want to be a fat cow no one will love, do you?" She projected her body hatred onto her daughter, convincing her that the love of the audience was the only love she deserved, and that love demanded sacrifices. The peak of this absurdity came when Judy, already an adult and famous, tried to fire her mother as her manager. What did the loving mom do? She sued her own daughter. She demanded money for upkeep and upbringing. To Ethel Gum, Judy was not a child, but a high-yield business project. And when the asset tried to gain independence, the shareholder went on the attack. It was the mother's betrayal that dealt the fatal blow to Judy's psyche. Mayer was just a boss. Cruelty was expected from him. But when the knife in your back is wielded by the one who gave you life, trust in people vanishes forever. Judy spent her life searching for a replacement for maternal love, throwing herself into the arms of fans and fleeting lovers. But the black hole left by Ethel Gum was too vast. Act 6. The Hunger Games. When we dive into the tragedy of Judy Garland, drugs often steal the spotlight, overshadowing another monstrous facet of her exploitation. We overlook the physical foundation of her suffering. Amphetamines were just half the equation. The other half was relentless, enforced starvation. In pop culture, there's a stereotype about stars dieting for the red carpet. But what happened to Judy wasn't a diet. A diet is a choice. For Garland, it was torture, akin to methods used in POW camps to break a prisoner's will. MGM declared war on a teenager's natural biology. Louis Mayer decided Dorothy had to remain forever small, flat, and weightless. Any hint of womanly curves, any extra ounce, signaled sabotage of a multi-million-dollar production. To combat this sabotage, they built a system of total surveillance and deprivation. Let's look at the menu of America's highest-paid teenage girl in the late 30s. While her peers drank milkshakes and ate burgers, Judy's daily diet had three components: black coffee, no sugar, no milk; chicken broth, often just tinted water where chicken had been boiled, minus the meat; cigarettes. The studio got her hooked on smoking in her early teens. MGM doctors had a criminally simple logic: nicotine kills hunger. Judy smoked up to 80 cigarettes a day, 4 packs. Imagine what that does to a singer's lungs when her voice is her main asset. But the bosses cared less about her voice than her waistline. A cigarette was her breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In those rare moments she was allowed solid food, it was a tiny portion of cottage cheese salad. This diet was maintained for years, during a time when her body desperately needed building material. As a result, Judy developed chronic metabolic issues. Her body, in constant stress and starvation mode, began storing fat even from water, leading to even harsher restrictions from the studio. It was a vicious cycle. The less she ate, the worse her metabolism got, and the more brutal her overseers became. The worst part wasn't the lack of food, but the psychological terrorism that came with eating. Judy couldn't just sneak a sandwich. She lived in a panopticon. Mayer created a vast network of informants. Waiters in the studio cafeteria, costume designers, drivers, makeup artists, even her own friends. They all had direct orders, and sometimes bonuses, to watch Judy Garland's mouth. There's a documented story that perfectly illustrates this nightmare. Once in the MGM cafeteria, Judy, starving, tried to order a simple salad with dressing. The waitress, following orders from above, silently took the plate from under her nose and replaced it with an empty plate with a few lettuce leaves. No dressing. "You can't have that, Miss Garland," she said loudly, in front of everyone. Imagine the humiliation. A global star sits at a table, and the staff publicly denies her food like a naughty puppy. But the peak of this cruelty came on Judy's birthday. They threw a party on set. Press, photographers, smiles. In the center of the pavilion stood a huge, beautiful cake. Judy, who hadn't eaten real food in weeks, looked at it like treasure. When it came time to cut the cake, a director, some say it was Mayer himself or his assistant, approached and uttered a line fit for a horror movie. "You can look at it, Judy. You can even smell it, but you won't eat a bite." They let her pose with the cake, pretending to eat it for the press. Then they took it away and gave her the usual bowl of broth. It was twisted psychological torture, aimed at conditioning her to see food as the enemy. Food was forbidden fruit. The pleasure of eating was a crime. This method worked, but not as the studio planned. Instead of becoming a slender fairy, Judy developed a severe eating disorder for life. Her life became an endless battle with weight. As soon as control loosened, like after leaving MGM, she'd binge, trying to fill the black hole of hunger carved in her childhood. She'd rapidly gain weight. The press would hound her with "Fat Judy" headlines. She'd spiral into depression and starve herself with pills again. This cycle of hunger, binge, shame, hunger haunted her to the end. MGM didn't just take away her meals. They broke her basic survival instinct and relationship with her own body. They taught her to hate herself for every bite. MGM's Hunger Games were won by the studio. They got their picture. But the loser was a living person whose physical and mental health was sacrificed so Dorothy could look fragile enough for the land of Oz. Act 7, The Million-Dollar Ugly Duckling. When we talk about Hollywood's dark side, we often focus on physical or sexual abuse. But there's a subtler, almost invisible form of cruelty that shatters a person just as effectively as amphetamines. It's the systematic destruction of self-worth. In Judy Garland's case, MGM executed perhaps the most successful psychological assassination in showbiz history. They took an incredibly talented girl and convinced her she was a physical monstrosity, a freak of nature to be hidden behind makeup and prosthetics. Judy's tragedy wasn't just her early death. It was living her entire life hating the face in the mirror. Even when millions adored her worldwide, she saw only the little hunchback Louis Mayer painted in her mind. This is the tale of how America's sweetheart saw herself as the most repulsive creature alive. To grasp the pressure, you need context. MGM in the 30s and 40s was Olympus. The studio collected the planet's most beautiful women. In the cafeteria where Judy was forbidden to eat, Lana Turner, Ava Gardner, Hedy Lamarr, and Elizabeth Taylor sat at nearby tables. These women had sculpted figures, perfect profiles, and flawless screen appeal. Judy Garland was different. She had a sweet, animated face, huge, expressive eyes, and incredible charisma. In a normal world, she'd be a beauty, but in MGM's warped reality, she was defective. Too short at 5 feet, her neck too stubby, her nose too turned up. Mayer and the producers didn't just notice these traits, they weaponized them. They used the girl next door concept not as a compliment, but as a derogatory brand. The daily message drilled into her was clear. Look at Lana Turner. That's a star. You're just Judy. You're ordinary. You're plain. No one will watch you for your looks. We tolerate you only for your voice. Be grateful we let you on screen with these goddesses. This gave Garland a deep imposter syndrome. She felt like a mutt mistakenly led into a purebred show. But the studio didn't stop at words. They began fixing her face as if it were clay, not living flesh. Each filming day started with procedures that seem barbaric now. First, the nose. Producers disliked her natural, slightly upturned nose. It wasn't aristocratic enough. So, before each shoot, makeup artists inserted rubber discs and plugs into her nostrils. These devices reshaped her nose, making it more upturned and thin, but caused constant pain and discomfort. It was non-surgical rhinoplasty by brutal mechanical means, stretching the nose from the inside to make it appear thinner outside. Judy lived in fear that while singing or dancing, when her breathing quickened, these discs would pop out, exposing her ugliness to the world. Second, the teeth. She had a natural, charming smile, but the studio deemed it imperfect. They fitted her teeth with special veneers and caps to align them to an unnatural Hollywood whiteness. This altered her diction, strained her jaw, but who cared? Third, the hairline. Studio stylists thought her forehead too low and hairline uneven. The solution? Electrolysis. They burned away hair follicles to raise her forehead line and create the perfect arch. And finally, the body. As mentioned in the context of The Wizard, her bust and waist were bound in constricting garments. But this wasn't just for Dorothy. The studio waged war on her femininity for years. They wanted an eternal teenager. While her peers like Lana Turner flaunted their sexuality and became style icons, Judy was dressed in frilly, childlike dresses that hid her figure. She was forbidden to grow up. This ugly duckling complex became the foundation of her identity. Mayer got what he wanted, a controllable star. Judy believed that without the studio's magic, without makeup artists, without lights in those torturous prosthetics, she was nothing. She feared stepping outside without makeup. She was terrified of being seen as she was. The cruelest paradox was that men genuinely fell for her. Her charisma, humor, and vulnerability were magnetic, but she didn't believe them. How could anyone love a little hunchback? She thought any man complimenting her was either lying, wanted something, money, fame, or was as flawed as she was. This wrecked her personal life. She chose partners who confirmed her low self-esteem, cheating on her or living off her, because she subconsciously believed she deserved no better. MGM crafted a glossy image adored by the world. But inside that image was a woman who looked at her magazine photos and didn't recognize the person staring back. She was a prisoner of her own fabricated inadequacy until her last breath. In the end, the Dream Factory convinced the brightest star of her time that she was just a defective part needing constant repair. And no plastic surgery could fix that break in her soul. Act 8, Cellmate. In tales of tragic fates, the victim often stands alone, trapped in a tower of their own suffering. But Judy Garland's case was unique, and thus even more horrifying. She wasn't burning in this hell alone. She had a partner, a cellmate who endured the same tortures, swallowed the same pills, and snatched sleep in the same brief moments between takes. His name was Mickey Rooney. On screen, their duo embodied the American dream. The energetic guy and the girl next door, ready to put on a musical in an old barn and save the day. In reality, Mickey and Judy were perhaps the most famous captives in human history. Analyzing Mickey Rooney's fate is crucial to understanding Judy's story. He serves as a kind of control group in MGM's inhumane experiment. Skeptics often say, maybe Judy was just weak. Maybe she had a genetic predisposition to addiction. Rooney's fate proves otherwise. The system was designed to break anyone, regardless of gender or mental fortitude. The only difference was how the pieces shattered. The studio called them the Dream Team, but MGM's cynical accountants used another term, gold mine. The Andy Hardy series and their musicals raked in astronomical profits. This created a situation where downtime for these two actors was economically unacceptable. To Mayer, Judy and Mickey weren't two separate people, but a single production unit. If one broke, the other stopped. So their exploitation was synchronized. Their work schedule defies modern logic. They film movies back to back. Mornings wrapped up one film, afternoons were for costume fittings for the next, and evenings were dance rehearsals. They spent 18 to 20 hours a day together. This forged a unique but pathological bond. It wasn't just friendship or first love, it was a trauma bond. They were the only people on the planet who understood what really happened behind the closed doors of the sound stages. When they looked into each other's eyes during musical numbers, they didn't see stage glitz, but the reflection of their own madness and drug-induced haze. In his later interviews, as an old man, Mickey Rooney confirmed every word Judy said about the pills. He described MGM's studio hospital not as a place of healing, but as a pit stop in a Formula One race. When both teens collapsed from exhaustion, they were literally carted to the infirmary. There they received B12 shots mixed with amphetamines, waited for the chemicals to hit, and were sent back to the set. We were turned off and on, Rooney said. We were synthetic products. But there was another, more insidious level of manipulation. Mayer used them against each other. He employed triangulation tactics. When Judy cried or complained of fatigue, Mayer pointed to Mickey. Look at him. He works as much as you do, but he doesn't whine. He's a man, and you're letting him down. If you go to sleep now, the film shuts down, and Mickey loses his job because of you. This crushed Judy with guilt. She adored Mickey. The thought of harming her only friend made her swallow her tears and pills and keep going. They did the same to Mickey, but with a different twist. You have to look after her. You're the man. Keep her in line. This placed an unbearable responsibility on the teenager for another person's life. So why did Mickey Rooney live to 93 while Judy burned out at 47? The answer lies in psychological defense mechanisms. The MGM system broke them both, but their reactions to trauma were different. Judy turned her pain inward. She blamed herself, her body, her inadequacy. This led to self-destruction, suicidal tendencies, and deep depression. Mickey turned his pain outward. His break manifested in a chaotic lifestyle. He became obsessed with gambling, losing millions. He married 8 times, unable to form stable relationships. He grew aggressive, cynical, always chasing the dopamine high to replace the amphetamines of his youth. His survival isn't a success story. It's the tale of a man who was just physically tougher, but whose soul was equally scarred. In Judy's final years, they often called each other. These were conversations between 2 war veterans, from a war no one knew the truth about. Rooney recalled how Judy would call him in the middle of the night, delirious, speaking in the voice of little Dorothy. She never escaped that dressing room where they sat on the floor, shaking from stimulant overdoses, waiting for the call of action. Their partnership is proof that the Dream Factory worked like a meat grinder. Live children went in, and golden statues and broken lives came out. And the fact that one of them lived longer only underscores the horror of what the one who couldn't survive went through. Act 9. Echo in an empty room. Every tale of exploitation has an expiration date. In the corporate world, when a machine stops turning a profit and starts demanding too much upkeep, it gets scrapped. For MGM and Judy Garland, scrapping wasn't just firing. It was character assassination and ultimately physical demise. We've reached the finale that shatters the last romantic myth of Hollywood, the myth that they don't abandon their own. The truth is, the system Mayer built had no rehab program for broken toys. Once the chemical cocktails fed to Judy for 15 years finally wrecked her nervous system, making her unstable and difficult to film, the studio didn't send her to a clinic. They tossed her out, ensuring the press painted her not as a victim, but as a temperamental diva. Judy's end at MGM didn't come with an orchestra's swell, but in the ringing silence of a bathroom in June of '50. By then, her body, ravaged by starvation and drugs, began to fail. She was late to shoots, couldn't remember lines, had panic attacks on set. The studio that created her addiction now used its symptoms as a death sentence. When they told her she was being pulled from the musical Royal Wedding, Judy's psyche snapped. She ran to her bathroom, shattered a glass, and tried to slash her throat with the shards. This wasn't a theatrical gesture. It was an act of pure animal desperation. The blood on the tiles was real, but MGM's reaction to their star's suicide attempt reveals their depth of cynicism. When the bosses heard about their star's suicide attempt, their first reaction wasn't compassion. It was PR panic. While doctors stitched up the neck of the woman who'd made them millions, MGM's press office spun a tale. The next day's papers claimed Judy was a little under the weather or had a minor accident. The studio hid the suicide attempt to protect stock prices, but used it as legal grounds to terminate her contract. In September, after 15 years of grueling work, Judy Garland was officially fired from MGM. No severance, no health insurance. Branded as an unreliable drunk, shutting doors at other studios. It was the classic drug dealer's play: hook the client, drain them dry, then toss them aside when they're broke and sick. The next 19 years of Judy Garland's life weren't living, but a slow, agonizing fade, interrupted by flashes of brilliance on stage. She toured the world, performing concerts, including the legendary Carnegie Hall show, not for fame, but to survive. She had colossal debts. The IRS hounded her, taking every cent. There were times when the planet's greatest star slept on friends' floors because she couldn't afford a hotel. But the most terrifying legacy of the Dream Factory was that she never learned to sleep. The protocol set in childhood ran flawlessly to the end. Without pills, she couldn't exist. Her body demanded ever higher doses. Doctors in London, New York, and Los Angeles kept prescribing, seeing her not as a patient, but as a legend they couldn't refuse. Judy's voice changed. It grew lower, deeper, with a crack that made audiences weep. But they didn't realize they were applauding the sound of a soul falling apart. They came to see if she'd collapse on stage. Her suffering became part of the show. The end came on June 22nd, 69, in London, 12 days after her 47th birthday. Judy Garland was found dead in the bathroom of a rented apartment. She was sitting on the toilet. Cause of death, barbiturate overdose. The same calmatives MGM's kindly doctor first gave her at 13 to sleep before a shoot. Her blood contained a concentration of the drug equivalent to dozens of Seconal pills taken over time. This wasn't sudden suicide. It was a systematic poison buildup. Her body, worn like an 80-year-old's, as the coroner noted, just stopped. Her liver, destroyed by years of malnutrition and chemicals, failed. The heart Mayer checked with his hand stopped beating. Judy Garland's tragedy isn't a price of fame story. It's an industrial crime tale. She was history's first victim of profit-driven biohacking. The studio rewrote her biological clock, replaced her blood with chemicals, and swapped her identity for a stage persona. When we watch the rainbow at the end of The Wizard of Oz, we must remember the girl singing of hope is high, in a corset crushing her lungs, dreaming not of a magical land, but just to sleep. She never found her way home to Kansas because she never had a home, only a factory. And when the factory shut down, Judy Garland ceased to exist. Reality was scarier than any Hollywood nightmare scriptwriters could dream up. Dorothy didn't wake up. We've traversed the 9 circles of Hollywood's golden age hell. We've seen how the system turned a healthy child into a dependent invalid. We've learned the fairy tale munchkins were real predators. We've uncovered the truth about forced abortions and starvation. We've realized the enemy wasn't outside, but within the family. Judy Garland's story is the ultimate proof that behind every great myth lies great filth. Ruby slippers were never magic symbols. They were shackles glittered up. But every prison has its architect. If Judy was Hollywood's main victim, who really wrote these cruel rules? You'd be surprised, it wasn't cigar-chomping men. In the public mind, Mary Pickford is America's sweetheart, a naive angel with golden curls, a silent film victim. That's a lie. The reality is shocking. Mary Pickford was Hollywood's first godfather in a skirt. A brilliant tyrant and ruthless capitalist who had studio bosses by the throat. Judy's story is terrifying because others broke her. Mary's story is terrifying because she built this prison herself. She created the little Mary image to rule the industry, but ended up its only lifelong inmate, guarding her golden cage with a gun in her old age. You won't grasp Hollywood's true nature of power and madness until you see the real dictator's face. Move to the next video to learn how America's sweetheart became its cruelest warden.